Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. And it seems from the record that this verse in 1 Samuel 16, verse 18, is the first time that Saul hears of David. The first time David is introduced to him. That one who would play a big part in the rest of his life. That one who would be there at the forefront of the scriptural record. The one who would eventually succeed him on the throne of Israel. The one who would refresh his soul when that evil spirit came upon him. That one who would become his enemy, who he would seek to kill. And that one who would show him an example as to how he should live his life. And the one that even after the death of that man who was oppressing him, would mourn for him. But when this introduction was made, how insignificant it would have seemed to Saul. How very little he would have known of what was to come. And tonight then we plan to look at the relationship between these two men. To see these two men who had both been called by God, who had been anointed to be king over his people. But two very different men, with different emotions, different priorities, different personalities. The relationship between them starts in 1 Samuel 16 and stretches out to 1 Samuel 31 and even beyond with their households. We won't be able to look at all the details tonight, but hopefully we can build a picture to see how these two men lived their lives together. So I'd like to start then in 1 Samuel, first of all, chapter 15, just to get a bit of the background to it. Here in 1 Samuel chapter 15 we have the record of the destruction of the Amalekites. And we haven't got time to look at the detail of the chapter, but if we come to verse 3 of chapter 15, we read there that Saul was told to go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. And as we go through, we see how that they went against the Amalekites, but in verse 9, Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatlings, and of the lambs, and of all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. And so they spared of that which they had been told to destroy. And so in verse 10 we read that the word of the Lord came unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he is turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all that night. If we come down to verse 22, Samuel says to Saul, Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. If we come down to verse 26, Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with thee, for thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord hath rejected thee from being king over Israel. And as Samuel turned about to go away, he laid hold upon the skirt of his mantle, and it rent. And Samuel said unto him, The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbour of thine, that is better than thou. And so Saul had been rejected because he had disobeyed his God. He had not done that which he had been commanded to do. And if we come down to the end of verse 35, we read that Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. And that phrase there, that the Lord had repented that he had made Saul, is first used in Genesis chapter 6. Keep a finger in 1 Samuel, we're back there shortly, but come with me to Genesis and chapter 6. In Genesis chapter 6 we have the record, don't we, of Noah. We read in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1, It came to pass when man began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. If we come down to verse 5, And God saw the wickedness of that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And so here we have that same phrase used, that it repented God that he had made, in this instance, man, and in 1 Samuel, that he had made Saul to be king. And in the next few chapters of Genesis, we read, don't we, of how that way was prepared for salvation through the house of Noah. And similarly, as we come into 1 Samuel chapter 16, so we have the continuation of the line of the kings. Saul would be cut off as the wicked men in Genesis 6 would be. But David would be raised up to continue that line of kings. That line of kings would start once more with one who had found favour with God. 1 Samuel 16 and verse 1. And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go, I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. Yes, God had provided a king for himself among Jesse's sons. And again, we haven't got time to look at the details, but we know, don't we, how that David was taught to be king. And in verse 12, that Jesse sent and brought David in, and he was ruddy and with all of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look upon. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. And then verse 13, Samuel arises and anoints David. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. But verse 14, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. And so God's Spirit rests upon David, but it leaves Saul. Very similar, isn't it, to the visions that Ezekiel sees, where in chapter 10 of Ezekiel's prophecy he sees God's glory leave the temple due to the wickedness that was done at that time. And he saw that vision into the future, and that glory would return back once more to the house. And so here we have similar language with the Spirit of God leaving Saul and resting upon David. And so in verse 15, Saul's servant said unto Saul, Behold now, an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. Let our Lord now command thy servants which are before thee, to seek out a man, who is a cunning player on a harp. And it shall come to pass, when an evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. And Saul said unto his servants, Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me. And so then that response comes, which I quoted at the start, that they had found that one who was a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite. And quite a high commendation is given, isn't it? That he was cunning in playing. He was skillful in that which he could do. He was a mighty, valiant man. The expression there is an idea of a powerful force. It's used in Joshua 8 and verse 3, and if we just pop back there briefly. Joshua 8 and verse 3, we've got here the people in the days of Joshua going to take the city of Ai. And we read in Joshua 8 and verse 3, So Joshua rose, and all the people of war, to go up against Ai. And Joshua chose out 30,000 mighty men of valour, and sent them away by night. If you come over a couple of pages to chapter 10, Joshua chapter 10 and verse 7. We read there that Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valour. And so David is likened to those who would go up in battle, those who would go up against those cities to take them. The same language is also used of Gideon in Judges 6 and of Jephthah in Judges 11. And if we come back to 1 Samuel chapter 9, we find it was also used of Saul's father Kish. 1 Samuel 9 and verse 1. Now there was a man of Benjamin, whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zerah, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. Yes, it's the same Hebrew word as in 1 Samuel 16. Well, the next attribute assigned to David in 1 Samuel 16 was that he was a man of war. And this might seem a strange thing to describe someone who, as far as we could tell, had never actually been to war. He had been out looking after his father's sheep. But yet we read that here that he was a man of war. We'll consider that a little later on. The next one is that he was prudent in matters. That word prudent is used in Genesis 41. If you come back with me there. In Genesis chapter 41 we have the record of Joseph. Genesis 41, and we'll go in at verse 33. Genesis 41 verse 33. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. And if we come to verse 39, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. And again, the same Hebrew word is used there to describe Joseph. And if we come back a couple of pages to Genesis 39, while we're in Genesis, we'll just pick up a few other bits that we'll see later on. Genesis 39 and verse 3. We read there that his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And if we just pop down again to verse 6, he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught that he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person, and well favoured. And there's that goodly person is the same word as is used in 1 Samuel chapter 16 that goes on to describe David, that he was a comely person. And then the Lord is with him, as we saw in that verse 3 of Genesis 39. And so this was quite a high commendation, wasn't it, given to David? A man who was quite a young man at this stage, but he was given these attributes that he was recognised to be of a high quality. When verse 19 of 1 Samuel 16, Saul sent messengers unto Jesse and said, send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. And Jesse took an ass laden with bread, and a bottle of wine, and a kid, and sent them by David his son to Saul. And David came to him and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armour-bearer. Those two Hebrew words translated that he loved him greatly only appear together in a few occasions. I'd like to look at a couple of those now. If you come back with me to Deuteronomy in chapter 6. The book of Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. We read there, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And the word might there is the same as greatly in 1 Samuel 16. If we come over to Joshua chapter 22, again the two words appear there together. Joshua chapter 22 and verse 5. Joshua says to the Reubenites, the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, take diligent heed to do the commandment and the law, which Moses the servant of God charged you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cleave unto him, and to serve him with all your heart, and with all your soul. And that word diligent, to take diligent heed, again is that same word, greatly. They were to take great heed to do that commandment and the law. If we just come finally over to Psalm 119. Psalm 119 and verse 167. Psalm 119 verse 167. My soul has kept thy testimonies, and I love them exceedingly. And again, it's that word exceedingly. And so those three occasions that we've looked at are all describing a love one would have to keep God's commandments, to keep his laws, and to love their God. And so in the same way that we should love our God, so in the same way, Saul loved David. This was a great love that he had for him. And we read in 1 Samuel 16 verse 21 that David became his armour-bearer. And that shows, doesn't it, the love and the trust that Saul had for David, to have him to look after his armour in the battle. The main uses of the word to be the armour-bearer previously to this record occur in 1 Samuel chapter 14, where we have the record of Jonathan with his armour bearer. And again, we haven't got time to look at that, but we can see in that chapter how that the two of them go together. That the two of them go as one to go and take the garrisons of the Philistines. And we read in 1 Samuel 14 and verse 7 that his armour bearer said to Jonathan, "Do all that is in thine heart. Turn thee. Behold, I am with thee, according to thy heart." And so perhaps Saul was trying to replicate this, that he too wanted David to be like Jonathan's armour bearer, that they too could go as one against the enemies. We carry on with the record in 1 Samuel 16. Saul sent to Jesse in verse 22, saying, "Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favour in my sight." And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirits departed from him. And so yes, David found favour in the sight of Saul. He refreshed Saul in those times when he needed help. And so there was quite a positive start, wasn't there, to their relationship. There are these two men who are seemingly getting on well, with great love one for the other. Whereas we come into 1 Samuel 17, we have the record then of Goliath, and how the Goliath came against him. I understand you looked at this a few weeks ago, so again we're not going to look at any detail, other to look at a couple of verses where we have the interface between David and Saul. So come first of all to 1 Samuel 17 and verse 31. "And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for them. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And we go on, don't we, to see how he took them and he killed that lion and the bear. In verse 37, David said, Moreover, The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hands of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. And so David is brought before Saul to speak to him. And Saul says that he would not be able to go against him because he was but a youth, whilst Goliath had been a man of war from his youth. But back in 1 Samuel 16 verse 18, David had been introduced, hadn't he, as a man of war. That is how Saul had first heard of him, that he was a man of war, despite his youth. And I think David goes on, doesn't he, when he describes the lion and the bear, to show how he was a man of war. It wasn't a war against another nation in terms of the enemy, but it was looking after the sheep, wasn't it? The enemies of the sheep that he fought against. And in verse 37, Saul says to David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. Well, again, that's what we read, wasn't it, in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 18, that the Lord is with him. That Saul should have already knew that God was with David, that he would be with him in that battle. But in verse 38, we read that Saul arms David. Well, David had been appointed to be Saul's armour-bearer, hadn't he? Back in 1 Samuel 16, verse 21. And so it seems here that the roles are almost now reversed. But it wasn't quite, was it? Because David knew he didn't need that armour. He didn't need man's armour, because God was with him. If we come down now to verse 55, after the death of Goliath, we read there that when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. And the king said, Inquire thou whose son the stripling is. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him, and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said unto him, Whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And so Saul doesn't seem to know here who David is, who it is who has just killed Goliath. He doesn't seem to recognise that one who he loved greatly, that one who had found favour in his sight, that one who he had appointed to be his armour-bearer. But David responds in verse 58 that he was the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. He's using the same language, isn't he, as we've already seen again in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 18. That he was the son of Jesse, perhaps to remind Saul of those things which had gone before. But if we come now into chapter 18 that we read earlier, we read in verse 2 that Saul took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Again in 1 Samuel 16, he sent to Jesse, didn't he, to let David, I pray thee, stand before me. He wanted David to stay there with him. And so again now, he would not let him go any more to his father's house. And in verse 5, David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And so he went wherever Saul sent him. He obeyed that which he was commanded to do. And we read that he behaved himself wisely. I understand the idea of the Hebrew here for the behaving wisely is the idea of increasing, to increase in knowledge, to increase in understanding, or to prosper. It's used in Genesis chapter 3 verse 6 that Eve saw that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, to make one prosper. And again in Joshua 1 verse 7, only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses thy servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand nor to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. And we could think also, couldn't we, of Jacob with Laban, when he had looking after Laban's flocks, that when Jacob was there, they prospered, that he prospered before Laban. And we've thought already, haven't we, of Joseph. And back in Genesis 39 and verse 2, we read that the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 5, if we continue through the verse, we read that Saul set him over the men of war, perhaps replacing Abner as the captain of the host, as we saw in 1 Samuel 17 verse 55. That he was accepted in the sight of the people and of Saul's servants. Similar language is used of Christ in Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, that he grew in favour with both God and men. And so again, it seems that there is generally a positive relationship, isn't there, between Saul and David. But then comes the turning point in verses 6 to 9. It came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul, with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. And so the people give David more praise than they give to Saul. And that jealousy creeps in. He becomes wroth and displeased. And he eyes David from that day forward. At verse 10 we read that the evil spirit came once more upon him. And once more David is playing as at other times. And there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David to the war with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. And so now things have changed. Now Saul is looking to kill David. That one again who he greatly loved, he's now seeking to kill. In verse 12 we read that Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, and was departed from Saul. Saul was afraid of David. We might expect it the other way around, hadn't we? David was the one who Saul was trying to kill. But David doesn't seem to be afraid of Saul, but rather Saul of David. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. that word afraid there is quite an interesting word. In the English we sort of think of the word afraid to be fearful, to be frightened. Such as in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 10, when Adam says to God, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. But the word here is very different. The word here is used just short of 100 times in the Old Testament, and is more often than not translated to sojourn, or to abide. And according to Strong's, it's the idea of turning aside. In the case of sojourning, to turn aside from the road, to rest somewhere. We've also got the idea of to shrink or to fear. So we get the idea of Saul cowering away from David, to turn aside from him. So great was his fear towards David. But verse 31, therefore Saul removed him from him, and made him a captain over 1,000. And he went out, and came in before the people. And so David is demoted from being over the host to being over just 1,000 men. I'm not sure why Saul did this, but perhaps it was so that David was more involved with the warfare, that there was a more chance of him being killed. Or maybe it was merely just to reduce the interaction he would have to have with him. But verse 14, David's response to this. David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. David continued to prosper. Despite being demoted down, he was still increasing. And so verse 15, wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. And as we go through the next few verses, we see how that Saul tried to use his daughters his daughter's love for David as a way to trap David, as a way to find hurt for him. But if we come to verse 26, when his servants told David these words, what the king required, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughters, to wife. And so we've seen already, haven't we, how that David prospered, and here he goes and prospers once more. Saul sent him there that he might fall by the hand of the Philistines. But David goes and does double of that which was required of him. Again prospering because God was with him. Verse 28, and Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. He became yet more afraid and became David's enemy continually. But verse 30, then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass, after they went forth, that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. So David goes and he prospers again. He increases more than Saul's servants. We've already considered Joseph, haven't we? We've got another link back to him here. Because when he was in Egypt, he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, didn't he? That the magicians and the wise men were not able to do. He was able to. He prospered more than those magicians. And likewise Daniel in Daniel 4 and verse 18. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof. For as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, for thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. And just like Joseph and just like Daniel, so David became wiser and prospered more than all the servants of Saul. As we come now into 1 Samuel chapter 19, having seen that Saul has become David's enemy continually, Saul speaks to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. Saul is now actively seeking to kill David. Before he had set up a circumstance of events that David might happen to fall by the hand of the Philistine. But now he is actively seeking to ensure it happens. But in verses 4 to 6, we read how that Jonathan intervenes to to try and save David's life. And we come down to verse 8. And there was war again. And David went out and fought with the Philistines, and slew them with a great slaughter. And they fled before him. And so again, David prospers in those things which he is doing. And verse 9. The evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, as he sat in his house, with his javelin in his hand. And David played with his hand. And so that evil spirit returns once more to Saul. And David plays once more before Saul. We're back to that starting point, aren't we, in 1 Samuel chapter 16. But verse 10, Saul sought to smite David, even to the wall with a javelin. But he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall. And David fled, and escaped that night. And so now David commences his time on the run. That he has to flee from Saul. And we can see in the next few verses how that we have the record of Michal helping David to escape. And in verse 18 we read that David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. He ran and fled to Samuel, perhaps looking for comfort or support. And as we come into 1 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 3, when we have David and Jonathon speaking, David sware moreover and said, Thy father continually knoweth that I have found grace in thine eyes. And he saith, Let not Jonathon know this, lest he be grieved. But truly as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death. David was now fearing for his life. There was but a step between him and death. And as we go through the record of 1 Samuel 20, we have, don't we, the account of when David was absent for 2 days. When Saul asked Jonathan on the second day where David was. And Saul's response in verse 30 was that his anger was kindled against Jonathan. And he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion, and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father, and said unto him, Wherefore shall he be slain? What hath he done? And Saul cast a javelin at him to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David. And so we know that David has to flee again, that it is not safe for him to remain. And so in verse 42, Jonathan says to David, Go in peace. The Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. And he arose and departed. And Jonathan went into the city. So yes, David now has to flee from Saul. The affliction has got that bad. And as we come to 1 Samuel 22, we find David departed to the cave of Adullam, where we have the record of those 400 men joining him, those who were in distress, in debt, who were discontented. In verse 18 of 1 Samuel 22, we have the record of the death of the priest by the hand of Doeg the Edomite. And what a comparison this is to David in verse 23 of 1 Samuel 22, who says to Abiathar, Abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, but with me thou shalt be in safeguard. In chapter 23 we have David saving the city of Keilah from the Philistines. And in verse 7, Saul thinks that God hath delivered him into mine hand, for he is shut in, by entering into a town that hath gates and bars. And Saul called all the people together to war, to go down to Keilah, to besiege David and his men. So Saul thinks that God might have delivered David into his hand. But of course we know, don't we, from earlier, that God had left Saul. The Spirit of God no longer dwelt with him, but was rather with David. In verse 14, And David abode in the wilderness in strongholds, and remained in a mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. And so God didn't allow sought to destroy David. And we can go through, can't we, and see how that the same thing happens again. How that David moves on and Saul pursues after him. And we come to 1 Samuel 24. And here we have David in a cave, and Saul comes into that same cave in verse 3. And David and his men remained in the side of the cave. And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of the Lord, which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirts of Saul's robe privily. And we know, don't we, how that David, his heart smote him, it says in verse 5, because he had cut off the garment. He knew he shouldn't have lifted up his hand against the Lord's anointed. He too himself was the Lord's anointed, wasn't he? But he knew that his time was not yet. If we come down to verse, if we look at verse 6, David says to his men that the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master. He still viewed Saul as being his master, that one who God had put in charge. And in verses 8 to 15, David shows Saul how he could have killed him. He was showing Saul how he himself should have been living, that rather than pursuing David to cut off the Lord's future anointed king, he should remain and do that which he had been tasked to do. And in verse 16 we read that Saul lifts up his voice and wept, perhaps repenting somewhat of what he had done, recognising verse 17 that David had been more righteous than he. And again, the chase continues in chapter 26, doesn't it? Because the Ziphites, so in chapter 26 we have the Ziphites in verse 1, that came to Saul to Gibeah saying, Does not David hide himself in the hill of Hachilah, which is before Jeshimon? And so the chase starts once more. And again, David has that chance that he could have killed Saul. Because verse 5 of 1 Samuel 26, David arose and came to the place where Saul had pitched. And David beheld the place where Saul lay, and Abner the son of Ner, the captain of his host. And Saul lay in the trench, and the people pitched round about him. And we can see how David and Abishai go down to the people and take away the spear. And again, Abishai wants David to destroy Saul, but David says to him, Destroy him not, in verse 9. For who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And in verse 10, David said furthermore, As the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch forth mine hand against the Lord's anointed. Yes, David realised that it was not his role to remove Saul. It was God who would remove him at the right time. In verse 13, David goes back up to the hill and cries out in verse 14 to Abner. And says in verse 15, Art not thou a valiant man? And who is like to thee in Israel? Wherefore then hast thou not kept thy Lord the king? Art thou not a valiant man? That's what we read, wasn't it, of David in 1 Samuel 16. And it seems that this is perhaps the second time that Abner hasn't done that which he's appointed to do. He should have been there guarding Saul here. And perhaps in 1 Samuel 17 he should have been organising the destruction of Goliath. Time's racing away, so we haven't got time to look at all of the details. We have to skip forward a bit now, but we see how that again David shows Saul that he shouldn't be pursuing after him. And Saul says in verse 25, Blessed be thou, my son David, thou shalt both do great things, and shalt still prevail. So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. And that Hebrew word, thou do great things, is a Hebrew word, the idea of to accomplish, to do, repeated 2 times. And the word prosper again is the same Hebrew word, a different Hebrew word, but another Hebrew word repeated twice. One little translation I found translated the verse, To do you shall do, and to prevail you shall prevail. Yes, Saul recognised that God was with David, and that therefore David would prosper. And if we come now to chapter 31, we have the record, don't we, of the death of Saul, when he's fighting against the Philistines. And Saul says to his armour-bearer in verse 4, "Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through, and abuse me." But we know how his armour-bearer wouldn't do it, and so Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And so in verse 6, Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armour-bearer, and all his men, that same day together. And so we could end there, couldn't we? Because that's where the life of Saul ends. But this relationship between the 2 men continues through in their household. David still has that same mentality towards the house of Saul. We come into 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 4. We have that Amalekite who comes to David from the wall. And he tells David that he took the life of Saul. And so David says to him in verse 13 of 2 Samuel chapter 1, "Whence art thou?" And he answered and said, "I am the son of a stranger, an Amalekite." And David said unto him, "How wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand, to destroy the Lord's anointed?" And so David calls one of his young men to kill him. Still, David was not happy that Saul was dead. That man should not have lifted up his hand against the Lord's anointed. And so he killed him for doing it. And in verse 17, David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. In verse 21, he talks of the shield of Saul. Verse 22, the sword of Saul returned not empty. Verse 23, Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives. How many of us would call someone who had been seeking to kill us lovely and pleasant? And in verse 24, ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul. And we haven't got time, but we could go through and see how the Saul's house was established against David with Ishbosheth. And we could see how that Abner was trying to raise up a king against David. And how that David didn't want the vengeance taken when members of Saul's family were killed. But he was to look after Mephibosheth. And in 2 Samuel 21 we read that he buried the bones of Saul. This, despite all that had been done to him, David was still not going to go out against the house of Saul. He would still show love and kindness to them. And so we've seen these 2 very different men. One who trusted in God, and God was with him. One who waited patiently for the fulfillment of the promises given to him, that he would be king. The one who spent years suffering at the hand of his oppressor, but who didn't retaliate, who knew that God was in control, that God would remove Saul when it was right. And after his death mourned the death and showed kindness to Saul's house. While Saul had done wickedly, he had departed from God. He knew that God was with David. He knew that David would be king, but still pursued after David, trying to frustrate the purpose of God. Let's conclude by turning to Psalm 37. Here we have a psalm which David was inspired to write many years later. And I think as we go through, we can see some of the language and the emotions of David and the things we've considered this evening in that psalm. Psalm 37 and verse 1. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity. For they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord, and do good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. Commit thy way unto the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. And he shall bring forth the righteous as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday. Rest in the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way, because the man who bringeth wicked devices to pass. Cease from anger, and forsake wrath. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. For evildoers shall be cut off, but those that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth. For yet a little while, and the wicked shall not be. Yea, thou shalt diligently consider his place, and it shall not be. But the meek shall inherit the earth, and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. The wicked plotteth against the just, and gnasheth upon him with his teeth. The Lord shall laugh at him, for he seeth that his day is coming. The wicked have drawn out the sword, and have bent their bow, to cast down the poor and needy, and to slay such as be of upright conversation. Their sword shall enter into their own heart, and their bows shall be broken. Verse 27, depart from evil, and do good, and dwell for evermore. For the Lord loveth judgment, and forsaketh not his saints. They are preserved for ever. But the seed of the wicked shall be cut off. The righteous shall inherit the land, and dwell therein for ever. The mouth of the righteous speaketh wisdom, and his tongue talketh of judgment. The law of his God is in his heart, none of his steps shall slide. The wicked watcheth the righteous, and seeketh to slay him. The Lord will not leave him in his hand, nor condemn him when he is judged. Wait on the Lord, and keep his way, and he shall exalt thee to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, thou shalt see it. I have seen the wicked in great power, and spreading himself like a green bay tree. Yet he passed away, and lo, he was not. Yea, I sought him, but he could not be found. Mark the perfect man, and behold the upright, for the end of that man is peace. But the transgressors shall be destroyed together, the end of the wicked shall be cut off. But the salvation of the righteous is of the Lord. He is their strength in the time of trouble. And the Lord shall help them, and deliver them. He shall deliver them from the wicked, and save them, because they trust in him.